Hi, I'm Nina McVeigh.
And I'm Connie Fanders.
Today we're going to be looking at the bias binder and the innovative things that we can do with it, whether it's quilting and putting on a binding without seeing the stitching, or whether it's something in the crafting like making trim for a pillow, or even garment sewing with this little girl's dress and binding the collar.
You know, I love this on the collar. You know, I have bound many quilted projects before, but I love it on the collar.
Well, the bias binder is a great garment sewer's friend.
It is.
Let me show you how easy this is to do. I've attached the bias binder to the machine by screwing it on, and there are instructions when you purchase a bias binder on how to do that. I have also attached the bias binder foot number 95C. I've loaded the bias binder with a bias strip. Now, we do have different sizes of bias binders, so it's going to depend on the size bias binder you are using. This one is the smallest bias binder, so I've cut my bias about 1 1/8 inches wide, and I've got a mitered end, so it's going to be a lot easier to load into the binder.
Do you do anything to the fabric to prepare it before you cut your strips?
Sometimes I do spray starch it, so
Okay.
it has a little bit more body. When I load the binding in the binder, it's going to go through the first part here, and right about at this bend it gets folded in half, and that's all done for you with the attachment. And then further on it gets folded in half again, so as it comes out under the foot and behind the foot, it is already folded bias binding.
I've always been amazed how perfectly that bias binder can fold that fabric every single time.
It is amazing, and that's why we use it. So let me show you how easy this is. I've got a quilt sandwich. I'm just going to put it into the bias binder and bind the edge of it. Only this time I'm going to be using a blind hem stitch or a blind applique stitch, because a lot of people don't want to see stitching on the binding. So I've set it up so that as this comes through, the stitch is actually sewing right next to the binding, and when it jumps over, it's taking a bite into the binding.
That's beautiful.
And then of course you can change the settings of the stitch and narrow it up a little bit so you just have a little bit of a bite, and you're going to see that same thing on the front and the back. So you're going to want to adjust that stitch so it's stitching right next to the binding, but it's taking a bite into the binding. I'm using regular thread, but if I were doing this on a quilt, I might be using a monofilament thread so you can't see it, and that little bite into the binding looks like hand stitching. Today I've done this on a straight edge, Connie, so you can see the stitch. I just wanted you to see that blind applique stitch, and actually how you don't see that blind applique stitch on the binding itself. But on my quilt here, I have done a scalloped edge all the way around so that I didn't have to worry about corners, and that of course makes the technique much easier. And it's the same thing on the collar. It's not a square collar, it is a rounded collar. It just makes it a lot easier.
Well, and it's just as beautiful as trying to do a corner.
Right. And the next thing I want to show you is another innovative technique, and that is binding trims. Whether you're binding Rickrack, as I've done here, and that's what I'm going to show you today, or actually any other kind of trim if you want to bind lace or whatever you're working with. So as I do that, I'm going to have my binding loaded in the bias binder. I'm going to take a piece of Rickrack. I'm not attaching this to anything. I'm just making the trim. So I'm going to insert the Rickrack into the binding. I actually have to change my stitch, so I am going to go back to a straight stitch, and I need to move my needle position, so this is going to be on the binding itself.
And so you moved it to the right.
I did move it over to the right, so the stitch is on the binding. And I'm not sewing this to anything, I'm just sewing trim.
But could you add that to a piece of fabric at the same time?
You could. It would take a little bit more practice because you've got a lot of different things going on at the same time. I want to make this as a trim because I want to add it to the skirt of this little dress that I'm making. And so it's not really going to be bound to anything. It's just going to be trim.
And Nina, how do you plan to attach it to your dress?
I am going to use a straight stitch, and I'm going to attach this trim right where my hem will be sewn. So it'll be several inches up from the bottom. But it's a very unique trim and really adorable on this little dress.
What a wonderful professional finish to that adorable dress, Nina.
Thank you, Connie. I really have fun experimenting, and I encourage you to experiment and play with the bias binder for some wonderful finishes, whether it be on your quilts
Or your pillows. I love this pillow. I mean, I can imagine this on a lot of finishing touches.
and garment sewing. As a garment sewer, I love the bias binder. For more information on the bias binder and other innovative techniques, visit your local Bernina dealer today.